My name is Brielle. I'm 34 years old, a freelance designer, a wife, and for a long time, I was the woman who moved cities for love and slowly misplaced her sense of home. Most people who meet me describe me the same way: calm, reasonable, easy. I don't interrupt, I don't raise my voice, I don't demand attention in a room. If anything, I make things smoother, softer, more comfortable for everyone else. I've been told that's a strength. But sometimes, what's the world calls easy is just a woman swallowing her own discomfort so no one else has to feel it. I married someone from another city, someone warm, ambitious, certain of himself. When we decided to build our life in his hometown instead of mine, it felt romantic. Brave, even. I told myself love was about movement, about flexibility, about choosing us over geography. What I didn't expect was how quietly disorienting it would feel to wake up in a place where no one had known me before I was someone's wife. This isn't a story about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There was no scandal splashed across social media, no screaming matches, no shattered plates on the kitchen floor. If you're here for explosive revenge, you won't find it. This is a story about something slower, about subtle shifts in how people treat you when you're the outsider, about the small comments that don't seem worth correcting, about becoming useful instead of understood, about how living far from my family forced me to grow up faster than I expected. It's about the moment I realized that I had confused adaptation with erasure. And it's about what happens when silence stops being survival and becomes strategy. I'm going to tell this honestly, not to vilify anyone, not to prove that I won, but because sometimes emotional justice isn't loud, sometimes it's just clarity, and clarity changes everything. If you've ever moved somewhere for love and felt your identity blur at the edges, you might understand this more than you think. Have you ever looked around your own life and wondered when it stopped feeling like yours? When I first moved to Bristol after marrying Daniel, I told myself I wasn't starting over. I was expanding. That's what people say, isn't it? When you leave your own city, your own rhythm, your own people. They call it growth, adventure, a fresh chapter. Daniel's family welcomed me politely. His mother hugged me the way people do when they are careful not to squeeze too tight. His sister complimented my coat. His friends asked me about the move as if I were a visiting professional temporarily assigned to their town. No one was unkind, but no one knew me. Back home, I had context, history, inside jokes that didn't need explaining. My childhood best friend could read my silence like a subtitle. My parents could hear a shift in my voice and know something was wrong before I did. In Bristol, I was introduced as, "This is Brielle. She's Daniel's wife." Not Brielle, who once ran her own design studio at 26. Not Brielle, who managed her father's medical paperwork during his illness. Not Brielle, who could rebuild her entire financial plan from memory. Just Daniel's wife. At first, I didn't mind. It made sense. I was new. They had shared decades together. School stories, old holidays, layered memories. I was the add-on. So I observed. At dinners, I passed plates and smiled at anecdotes I didn't understand. When someone asked what I did, I gave the simplified answer: I work from home, graphic design. Must be nice, one of Daniel's friends said once, grinning. Flexible little hobby. Little hobby. I laughed lightly, as if I hadn't heard the word hobbyland heavier than it should have. That became the pattern. I was described as sweet, as quiet, as so adaptable. Adaptable. It's a flattering word when you're talking about travel. Less flattering when you realize it means you bend without anyone asking if it hurts. Daniel never corrected anyone. Not maliciously, he just didn't notice. To him, I was steady, self-sufficient. I handled my own clients, my own schedule, my own friendships, even if those friendships were now long-distance phone calls squeezed into time zone gaps. In group settings, decisions were made quickly, restaurants chosen, weekends planned. I would open my mouth once or twice, then close it when the conversation moved on without registering my input. No one excluded me deliberately, but inclusion requires effort, and effort wasn't necessary when I was already being agreeable. The strangest part wasn't their behavior. It was mine. I began pre-editing myself. I stopped referencing back home because it felt like I was comparing. I softened my accent unconsciously. I adjusted my schedule around Daniel's family traditions before protecting my own. It felt mature at the time, generous, but invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, like condensation on glass, subtle, until suddenly you can't see through it. The first Christmas after we married, we spent it entirely with his family. That made sense logistically. My parents understood. They always understood. But I remember standing in his childhood kitchen, watching everyone move around each other effortlessly. They knew where the extra plates were kept, who liked which dessert, which cupboard door stuck if you pulled too hard. I didn't know where the tea towels were, and no one thought to show me, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't see me as someone who needed orientation. I was simply expected to flow. Later that evening, Daniel's aunt squeezed my hand and said, "You're settling in so well. You hardly make a fuss at all." I smiled. I have never liked making a fuss. But that was the first time I wondered if being low maintenance had quietly turned me into low priority. Back home, I was layered, complex, assertive in my own soft way. Here, I was listening to pleasant background music. And the unsettling truth? Part of me thought that was the price of love. You move, you adapt, you don't complain. You earn your place slowly. I told myself that belonging just takes time. I didn't yet understand that belonging also requires being seen. And at that point in my marriage, I was visible only in relation to someone else. Daniel's wife. The flexible one, the easy one. I didn't resent them. Not yet, but I had started to shrink. And shrinking, I would later learn, feels eerily similar to being polite. The first real cut didn't look like one. There was no raised voice. No insult is sharp enough to repeat dramatically to a friend over the phone. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, 3 months after the wedding. Daniel's parents had invited us for lunch: roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, the kind of meal that smells like stability. I had offered to bring dessert, something small from a bakery near our flat that I loved. It felt like a way to contribute something of mine to a space that was still mostly theirs. When we arrived, Daniel's mother greeted him first, of course. That was natural. Then she looked at the box in my hands. "Oh," she said, in that light tone people use when they don't mean to sound dismissive. "You didn't need to bring anything. We already have pudding." I smiled. "I know, I just thought it would be nice." She took the box from me and placed it on the side counter, not with the other food, but near the kettle, slightly apart, like an afterthought. Lunch unfolded the way it always did. Stories from Daniel's childhood, updates about his sister's new job, commentary about neighbors I didn't know. I listened. I asked questions. I laughed in the right places. When it came time for dessert, Daniel's mother brought out her trifle, layered, carefully assembled, praised before it even touched the table. No one mentioned the box I had brought. It remained by the kettle. Halfway through dessert, Daniel's aunt noticed it. "What's that then?" "Oh," his mother said lightly, almost surprised. "Brielle brought something, but we've plenty here." The box was opened briefly, a polite murmur. "Looks lovely." Then it was closed again. No one was cruel. No one mocked me. But something inside me registered the hierarchy. Theirs first, mine optional. On the drive home, I stared out the window. Daniel chatted about how good the trifle had been, how comforting it felt to eat something he'd grown up with. I almost said it then. I almost said, it felt strange that what I brought wasn't even placed on the table. But the thought felt small, petty. So instead I said, "Your mom seemed happy today." He nodded. "Yeah, she loves hosting. It's her thing." Her thing. That phrase lingered. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a simple case of too much food. Families have rhythms. I was still learning theirs. But the next time we visited, I didn't bring anything. No one noticed that either. That's when I realized the dessert hadn't really been about dessert. It had been about the contribution, about signaling that I wasn't just passing through, that I wanted to add something to the table. And without discussion, that addition had been quietly declined. The first small cut is dangerous because it's deniable. If I had confronted it, I would have sounded sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful. They didn't mean it that way. "It's not a big deal. You're overthinking." And maybe I was. But our instincts don't flare up randomly. They whisper first, a tightening in the chest, a pause that lasts half a second longer than it should. I began noticing other small things. Plans were made in group chats where I was added last. Family decisions announced to Daniel that I heard about afterward. Jokes referencing "before you came along," always followed by a smile. Each one is harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. I was welcomed, but I wasn't central. And slowly, I began adjusting myself again, bringing less, offering fewer opinions, taking up even less space. Because if your contributions aren't needed, the polite response is to reduce them. That's what I believed at the time. I hadn't yet seen that every time I minimized myself to avoid discomfort, I was teaching everyone else how little to expect from me. The first small cut doesn't bleed loudly. It just teaches you where not to place your hands again. And I learned quickly, if the first cut teaches you where not to reach, The next ones teach you how to flinch silently. After the dessert incident, nothing dramatic happened. That was the strange part. There was no escalation, no clear turning point anyone else could point to and say, ah, that's when it changed. Instead, there was repetition. And repetition is how something subtle becomes normal. Daniel's friends began inviting us to things with phrasing that made me pause. Daniel, we're doing drinks on Friday. You two free? It was a small thing, that linguistic habit. But the invitation was always his, extended to me as an attachment. When I once answered directly in the group chat, confirming a time adjustment because I had a client call, the response came back to him privately. Is Brielle okay with that? As if my calendar required his authorization. He didn't notice the pattern. Why would he? He had never been the extension of someone else. At dinners, when I mentioned a book I was reading or a financial article I found interesting, the conversation would drift. But when Daniel repeated a similar point 10 minutes later, phrased slightly differently, heads nodded. Good point, mate. I began observing the mechanics of it. When I spoke, people listened politely. When he spoke, people leaned in. I told myself it was charisma, familiarity, history. I told myself I was imagining the rest, because acknowledging it would require a more uncomfortable question. Had I allowed myself to become background? One evening at his sister's birthday gathering, I offered to help in the kitchen. It was instinctive. I didn't want to hover awkwardly in the lounge while conversations ricocheted past me. In the kitchen, his mother handed me tasks automatically. Chop this, stir that, set the table. Brielle's so good in the background, she said fondly to one of the aunts. Never any fuss. Good in the background. It was meant as praise, but it landed like a label. Later that night, Daniel's sister joked, You've trained her well, Dan. Everyone laughed, including me. Daniel rolled his eyes lightly, kissed my temple, and said, She's her own person. It should have been enough. But it wasn't correct. It was a deflection. On the drive home, I stared at my reflection in the window, faint, superimposed over streetlights. Trained. Background. Easy. The words weren't aggressive. They were casual. That's what made them so effective. They slipped under the skin without resistance. And here's the part I don't say lightly. I participated. When someone interrupted me, I stopped speaking instead of reclaiming the floor. When plans ignored my preferences, I adjusted my schedule. When traditions excluded mine, I told my parents we'd figure something out next year. I rationalized everything. They don't know me yet. It takes time. It's not intentional. Don't be difficult. Living far from my family forced me to grow up faster than I expected, but not in the way I'd imagined. I thought growth would mean independence, adventure, resilience. Instead, it meant learning how quickly you can lose your reference points. Back home, if someone dismissed me, I had people who would gently say, That wasn't fair. Here, there was no chorus, only my own internal debate. And when you're the only one questioning something, it becomes easy to assume you're wrong. The most dangerous form of disrespect isn't loud. It's the kind you can explain away. Weeks turned into months. I became more efficient at anticipating needs. I'd check with Daniel before confirming social plans, just to keep things smooth. I'd phrase opinions as questions. Maybe we could consider, do you think it might help if... I thought I was being collaborative. In reality, I was lowering my volume. One night, lying in bed, I asked Daniel casually, Do you ever feel like I've changed since we moved? He turned toward me, puzzled. Changed how? I don't know, I said softly. Quieter, maybe. He smiled. You've always been calm. That's one of the things I love about you. It was sincere, but calm isn't the same as diminished. And somewhere inside, a quiet part of me began cataloging these moments, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Because when something keeps happening, and you keep forgiving it before anyone apologizes, at some point, you have to ask who benefits from your patience. There's a moment, subtle, almost administrative, when you realize you've been assigned a role. No one announces it. There's no formal agreement. But suddenly, you're operating within invisible boundaries you didn't consciously choose. For me, that realization came on a Tuesday evening. Daniel had invited two of his colleagues over for dinner. He told me about it the night before, apologetically, but casually. Hope that's all right, he said. I told them you wouldn't mind. Wouldn't mind. Would you like to? Does that work for you? Just the assumption of elasticity. And the unsettling part was, he wasn't wrong. I rearranged a client deadline, planned a menu, cleaned the flat, lit candles, smoothed everything into place. During dinner, I refilled glasses before anyone asked, cleared plates seamlessly, laughed at stories about office politics I wasn't part of. When one of the colleagues complimented the meal, Daniel smiled and said, "She's amazing at this stuff. Keeps everything running." This stuff. Running. I felt less like a partner and more like infrastructure. Not seen, just relied upon. Later, after they left, Daniel wrapped his arms around me. "That went perfectly. You're a lifesaver." It was meant with affection, but lifesavers don't usually get consulted. They just appear when needed. That night, lying awake, I began mapping it more clearly. In his family, I was the helpful addition. In his friend group, I was the agreeable wife. In our home, I was the quiet stabilizer. Reliable, useful, invisible. And here's the difficult truth: invisibility can feel virtuous. We're taught that being low drama is mature, that flexibility equals strength, that accommodating others is love. But accommodation without reciprocity slowly becomes an expectation. I thought back to small patterns I had dismissed. Daniel is checking with his sister about holiday dates before checking with me. His mother is texting him about plans for all of us, without including me. Friends asking him if I'd be okay with decisions that affected my schedule. No one was excluding me intentionally. They had simply learned the shape of my compliance. The role I had been assigned wasn't villainous. It was convenient, and I had fit into it so smoothly that no one questioned whether it matched me. The moment that crystallized, it happened a week later at a family barbecue. Daniel's cousin was discussing a potential move abroad for work. The conversation turned to compromise in relationships. "You just have to make sacrifices," his cousin said. "Someone always gives more." Daniel's aunt gestured toward me, smiling warmly. "Brielle understands that. She has lived her whole life here. That's commitment." Everyone nodded approvingly. I smiled too, but inside something tightened. The narrative had solidified. I was the one who gave more. And because I had done it gracefully, it became my defining trait. No one asked what I had left behind beyond geography. No one asked what it costs to rebuild identity in a place where your history doesn't precede you. Because I didn't volunteer that information. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, or homesick, or difficult. Living far from my family forced me to grow up faster than I expected. Not by making me stronger in obvious ways, but by forcing me to confront how quickly adulthood can become performance. You learn to function even when you feel unmoored. You learn to host even when you're lonely. You learn to smile through subtle erasure, because it feels too minor to protest. That barbecue evening, I watched Daniel laugh easily with people who had known him since childhood. He belonged effortlessly, and I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't building a life. I was maintaining one that revolved around him. The role was clear: support system, emotional shock absorber, background harmony. And if I continued without interruption, that role would calcify. The most dangerous thing wasn't that they expected it. It was that I had started expecting it too. That was the first time I allowed myself to ask a forbidden question. If I stopped being so accommodating, would anything collapse? Or would they simply notice I existed? The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful confession across a kitchen table. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, alone in our flat. Daniel was at work. The house was still. I had just finished a client call, a corporate rebrand for a firm in Manchester, and they had approved my proposal without revisions. The budget was higher than I'd expected. The tone in their voices carried something I hadn't felt in a while. Respect, not politeness, not indulgence. Respect. After the call ended, I sat at my desk longer than necessary. My navy notebook lay open beside me, filled with invoices, projections, deadlines, ideas, my real life, documented in quiet ink. I began reviewing my finances, something I'd always done meticulously. It grounded me. Numbers don't blur the way emotions do. That's when I saw it clearly. My income over the past 12 months has steadily increased. Not dramatically, but consistently. My client base had expanded. My savings account, the one I had kept separate out of habit, not secrecy, was stable, growing. I realized something startling. If I needed to, I could stand entirely on my own. The thought didn't thrill me. It steadied me. Up until that moment, a small part of me had operated under an unspoken fear that I was the one who had sacrificed location, community, proximity to family, and therefore was more dependent. But the numbers told a different story. I wasn't dependent. I was adaptable. There's a difference. I walked into the kitchen and looked around the space I had so carefully maintained. The polished counters, the framed photos, mostly of Daniel's childhood, his university years, his family holidays. There were a few of mine, tucked into corners. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. For months, I had been shrinking to preserve harmony, adjusting to protect the relationship, silencing discomfort to avoid being labeled ungrateful. But what if the real immaturity wasn't speaking up? What if it was abandoning myself quietly and calling it love? That afternoon, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't text his mother. I didn't make any announcements. I did something much smaller. I ordered plane tickets to visit my parents, alone, not for a holiday we had discussed together, not coordinated around his schedule, just a long weekend. When Daniel came home, I mentioned it casually while chopping vegetables for dinner. I'm going to see mom and dad next month, just for a few days. He looked surprised, but not upset. Oh, okay, that's good. He hesitated. I would have liked to come. You're welcome to, I said gently, but I booked it for me. There was a flicker in his expression. Not anger, not disapproval. Adjustment. That was the first time I noticed it. For once, I hadn't pre-checked his availability. I hadn't softened the decision into a suggestion. I had simply informed. That night, lying in bed, I felt something unfamiliar. Not rebellion, alignment. The shift wasn't about leaving. It wasn't about revenge or grand gestures. It was about recalibration. I began replaying the past year in my mind, not to dwell, but to analyze. Where had I over-accommodated? Where had I minimized myself preemptively? Where had silence been fear disguised as grace? Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But this was a different kind of adulthood. It required accepting that love doesn't demand disappearance. That partnership isn't proven through self-erasure. The next morning, I moved 2 framed photos in the living room. I placed one of my parents younger, laughing at a beach I grew up visiting, at eye level on the bookshelf. It was a small act. No announcement, no explanation. But it was the first time the room reflected both of us equally. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else yet, but internally, something had clicked into place. I stopped asking myself how to be easier and started asking a quieter, more dangerous question. What would it look like to take up space, calmly? After that Thursday, nothing dramatic changed on the outside. Dinner invitations still came through Daniel. Family group chats still moved quickly. Jokes still floated past me in familiar patterns. But something had shifted internally. Before, my silence had been reflex, a way to avoid friction. Now, it has become deliberate. There is a difference between being quiet because you feel small and being quiet because you are observing. At the next family lunch, I didn't volunteer to help in the kitchen immediately. I sat at the table and remained in the conversation. When someone interrupted me mid-sentence, I didn't retreat. I simply continued calmly, finishing my thought without raising my voice. The interruption didn't happen again. It wasn't confrontational, it was subtle. But it was new. Daniel noticed, though he didn't comment on it directly, his glances lingered a second longer when I spoke. Not confused, just recalibrating. Silence, when it is no longer insecure, unsettles people. I stopped pre-answering on his behalf. When his mother asked him in front of me, "Will Brielle be okay with that?" I didn't jump in reassuringly. I waited. Daniel looked at me. For the first time, he didn't answer for us automatically. "What do you think?" he asked. It was a small pivot, but it mattered. I responded evenly. "I'll need to check my calendar. I have a deadline that week." No apology, no explanation beyond logistics. His mother blinked, then nodded. Of course. The sky didn't fall. The room didn't tense. It had simply required me to exist audibly. I also began declining, gently. When plans were suggested last minute that disrupted my schedule, I said, "I won't make it this time, but thank you for inviting me." No elaboration, no defensive tone. At first, there were follow-up questions. "Everything okay? Busy again?" I smiled. "Yes, just prioritizing a few things." The more I did this, the more I realized something uncomfortable. No one had actually been demanding my constant accommodation. They had simply grown used to it, and habits persist until interrupted. Daniel, meanwhile, was adjusting in his own quiet way. One evening, he mentioned a weekend trip his friends were planning. "They're thinking of the 18th, he said. "Does that work?" He had never asked that before. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, to interpret it as proof that I had been undervalued. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. "Actually," I said, "I'll be away that weekend. I'm visiting my parents." He paused. "Right, you mentioned that." There was something in his tone, not resentment, but realization. For the first time, my life wasn't orbiting his schedule. Silence, when chosen, becomes information. I no longer filled conversational gaps with reassurance. I no longer laughed immediately at jokes that made me uncomfortable. I let pauses sit when comments were slightly dismissive. And in those pauses, people often corrected themselves. It was fascinating to watch. Daniel's sister once teased lightly, "Brielle never complains about anything." Instead of smiling automatically, I tilted my head slightly and said, I just don't complain publicly. The table went quiet for half a second. Then she laughed, but softer. I hadn't accused, I hadn't attacked. I had simply adjusted the narrative. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But now, that distance became an unexpected advantage. I wasn't entangled in childhood roles here. I wasn't the younger sister, the old classmate, the childhood nickname. I could redefine myself without contradicting history. And the more composed I became, the more carefully others responded. What they mistook for docility had always been restraint. Now that restraint was intentional. I began documenting things differently in my Navy notebook. Not grievances, patterns. Who assumed, who asked, who adjusted. Not to build a case, but to build clarity, because once you understand the structure of a dynamic, you can choose how to move within it. And I had stopped moving unconsciously. They thought I was still the easy one. They didn't yet realize that easy had evolved into deliberate. The interesting thing about being underestimated is this: it gives you time. When people believe you are passive, they stop guarding themselves. They assume predictability. They stop anticipating change. And in that space, you can prepare. No one noticed that I had begun restructuring my life quietly, not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger suspicion, just intelligently. I expanded my client base beyond referrals connected to Bristol. I began targeting firms in London, Edinburgh, and even internationally. I updated my portfolio, repositioned my services, raised my rates gradually, not enough to shock, just enough to signal value. When a client questioned the increase, I didn't over-explain. I outlined the deliverables calmly. Most agreed without hesitation. The ones who didn't weren't aligned anyway. At home, I reviewed our shared expenses more closely. Daniel and I had always split bills proportionally, something we both considered fair. But I started ensuring every contribution was documented clearly. Transfers labeled, agreements are written in email threads rather than assumed in conversation. Not because I planned to leave, but because I planned to never feel dependent again. I also reconnected with parts of myself I had muted. I joined a co-working space twice a week, something I had postponed because working from home was convenient. In reality, it had kept my world small. At the co-working space, no one knew me as someone's wife. I was just Brielle, capable, focused, professional. Conversations there revolved around ideas, strategy, growth. Not family history I couldn't access. I didn't mention these changes much at home. Not out of secrecy, but because I had stopped narrating my growth as if it required approval. Daniel noticed I was busier. You've been working a lot lately, he said one evening. I've been building, I corrected gently. He nodded, thoughtful. Meanwhile, socially, I shifted too. When his family discussed long-term holiday traditions, I introduced my own. I'd like to spend every other Christmas with my parents, I said one night evenly. There was immediate logistical chatter, mild surprise. But no one said no. They simply hadn't considered it before, because I hadn't insisted. That realization was almost unsettling. So much of what I had interpreted as disregard was, in part, my own reluctance to assert presence. But here's what they never noticed. I was observing who adapted willingly and who resisted. When Daniel's mother adjusted plans without complaint, I noted it. When his sister rolled her eyes subtly, I noted that too. When Daniel began looping me into conversations proactively, I registered it. Patterns matter, not to punish, but to understand. I also began strengthening my emotional independence. Instead of waiting for Daniel to suggest visiting my parents, I scheduled regular trips. Instead of venting to him about feeling out of place and hoping he would mediate, I addressed small misalignments directly and calmly with the person involved. One afternoon, when his aunt made another comment about how easy I was, I responded softly. I used to think being easy was the goal. Now I think being clear is better. She looked at me differently after that. Not offended, alert. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But what I hadn't anticipated was this: distance clarifies identity. When you are removed from familiar validation, you either dissolve or you define yourself intentionally. I chose the definition. Daniel didn't realize I was preparing anything, because I wasn't preparing an exit. I was preparing a quality. I updated my personal savings strategy, increased automatic transfers, reviewed legal frameworks around shared property, not obsessively, just responsibly. Information is not betrayal, it's maturity. And the more I educated myself quietly, the less anxious I felt. For the first time since moving, I wasn't operating from fear of losing stability. I was operating from self-trust. One evening at dinner with his friends, someone made a joke about me being the calm anchor. I smiled slightly and said, "Anchors can also lift." There was a brief pause. The conversation continued, but Daniel looked at me differently again. Curious, measuring. They never noticed the preparation because the preparation didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like composure. It looked like competence. It looked like a woman who had stopped shrinking and started positioning. And positioning, when done quietly, changes outcomes long before anyone realizes the game has shifted. The discovery didn't come with adrenaline. There was no cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was quieter than that. It happened on an ordinary evening when Daniel was out with friends, and I was alone at the dining table, laptop open, paperwork spread neatly in front of me. I had decided to do something practical. Review every major decision we'd made since getting married. Housing, finances, travel, family commitments, career adjustments. Not emotionally, structurally. I created 2 columns in my notebook. Compromises made, compromises reciprocated. The list wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even angry. It was factual. I moved cities. I adjusted holidays. I deprioritized proximity to my support system. I absorbed social adaptation into his world. On the other side, Daniel had been kind. He had been affectionate. He had been generally supportive of my work. But when it came to location, community, cultural integration, there was almost no movement in my direction. Not because he refused, because it had never been seriously proposed. That was the private reveal. The imbalance wasn't malicious. It was unexamined. And unexamined imbalances calcify into expectation. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle in my chest. For months, I had been asking myself whether I was overreacting, whether subtle discomfort justified internal recalibration. But numbers, emotional or financial, rarely lie. Then I opened our shared financial agreements more closely. The flat we lived in was technically rented under Daniel's name because he had been there longer before we married. My contributions were transferred monthly, documented, but informal. If something ever shifted suddenly, the legal ground beneath me would be softer. Again, not betrayal, oversight, but oversight only protects the person whose name is already printed on the lease. That was the second layer of clarity. I wasn't powerless, but I wasn't structurally anchored either. And here's the most important part. Instead of panic, I felt calm, because knowledge is stabilizing. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I didn't accuse him of imbalance. Instead, I drafted a plan, not an exit plan, an equilibrium plan. I began researching co-investment structures, joint tenancy agreements, long-term asset strategy. I updated my personal will, something I had neglected out of romantic optimism. Romance without paperwork is vulnerability. That sentence landed firmly in my mind. The private reveal wasn't that Daniel had wronged me. It was that I had assumed emotional security guaranteed structural security. It doesn't. I also realized something deeper. If our relationship ever faced a serious crossroads, relocation, career shift, family care, I had positioned myself as the one most likely to bend, because I had been the one who bent first. That was leverage, not leverage against him, leverage within myself, the power to say calmly, no longer. Later that night, Daniel came home laughing, slightly flushed from drinks. He kissed my forehead, asked what I'd been doing. "Just organizing a few things," I said. He didn't ask further. And that was the final layer of clarity. He trusted my competence, but he didn't yet grasp its scope. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. And growth, I realized, isn't loud. It's administrative. It's paperwork, it's savings accounts, it's clarity in language. It's understanding your options before you need them. That evening, as I closed my laptop, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving. Not homesickness, not resentment. Control, not over him, over myself. The private reveal was simple. I had more agency than I had been acting on. And once you see your leverage clearly, you can't unsee it. The question becomes, what are you going to do with it? Clarity is peaceful, but it is also demanding. Once I understood the structure of my life, the emotional patterns, the financial realities, the quiet assumptions, I couldn't return to passive comfort. I had options, and options require decisions. For weeks after the private reveal, I moved normally, cooked dinner, took client calls, visited Daniel's parents, laughed at the appropriate moments. But internally, I was evaluating paths. Option 1, continue as we were, but now fully aware. Adjust slowly, advocate gently, hope balance emerges organically. Option 2, initiate a difficult but calm restructuring conversation. Propose relocation in the future, redefine financial anchors, renegotiate family traditions formally. Option 3, Begin building a life that could exist entirely independent of his geography, even if the marriage remained intact. None of these options involved drama. None involved ultimatums, but one of them was irreversible. I knew that once I chose to prioritize structural independence fully, there would be no returning to unconscious reliance. I would stop bending first. I would stop assuming the burden of adaptation. I would require mutual inconvenience. And mutual inconvenience reveals true partnership. The decision crystallized during a phone call with my mother. She didn't complain about the distance. She never had. But that evening, her voice sounded tired. "Your father's checkup was good," she said, "but hospitals make him anxious now." I closed my eyes, picturing the familiar hallway of the clinic back home. The way my father pretended not to be nervous by asking overly practical questions. I wasn't there. And for the first time, the distance felt less romantic and more costly. After the call, I sat quietly in the living room. Daniel was reading. The television murmured softly in the background. I studied the framed photos again, his childhood, his university friends, his family holidays. And mine, reduced, curated, contained. I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt responsibility toward myself. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. It had taught me independence, resilience, and strategic thinking. But growth doesn't mean permanent exile from your own roots. That night, I made the irreversible choice. I decided that within 18 months, I would either establish a bi-city life with formal agreements, time split intentionally, assets structured equally, family obligations shared, or relocate back to my home city independently, whether married or not. I didn't tell Daniel immediately, because this wasn't a threat. It was a boundary I needed to build first before presenting. I began researching property options quietly in my hometown. Not extravagantly, just realistically. Rental markets, investment opportunities, co-working spaces. I also booked longer stays with my parents under the pretext of work flexibility, which was true. Every action was calm, practical. No one noticed a rupture, because there wasn't one. There was only alignment. A week later, Daniel mentioned casually, "I can't imagine ever leaving Bristol. It's just home." He said it affectionately, unaware of the weight of the word, home. I looked at him steadily and asked, "Would you ever consider building one somewhere else, even part-time?" He paused, surprised. "I've never really thought about it." That answer told me everything. He hadn't thought about it because he hadn't needed to. The decision point wasn't about whether he loved me. It was about whether love was flexible in both directions. And I had decided something quietly powerful. I would no longer sacrifice proximity to my aging parents indefinitely without a shared plan. Not angrily, not impulsively, but definitely. Once you choose your non-negotiable, your posture changes. You stop asking for permission to exist fully. You start presenting terms calmly. And the moment you know you can walk away, even if you hope you won't have to, your voice steadies in ways no one can ignore. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to be equal. And equality, I knew, would either deepen our marriage or reveal its limits. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it. I operationalized it. There's a difference between emotional declarations and structural shifts. I had done enough emotional processing alone. Now it was time to move carefully. First, I formalized my business further. I registered it under a limited structure instead of remaining a sole trader. It wasn't dramatic, just prudent. It separated liabilities cleanly, clarified income streams, gave me long-term leverage. I also opened a high-yield savings account tied exclusively to future relocation flexibility, not labeled escape, not even labeled home, just structured growth. Every month, an automatic transfer moved quietly, no ceremony, no tension. Daniel didn't question my financial adjustments. We had always maintained individual accounts alongside shared expenses. He trusted me, and I wasn't betraying that trust. I was strengthening it. Next, I addressed the housing issue, carefully. One evening over dinner, I said, "I've been thinking about our lease situation." He looked up. "What about it?" "I'd feel more secure if we either signed something jointly long-term or explored purchasing together. It's important to me that we're structurally equal." The word equal lingered. He didn't resist. He looked thoughtful. "I hadn't realized it mattered that much," he admitted. "It does," I said calmly. Not accusatory, not wounded. Clear. Over the next few weeks, we met with a financial advisor, discussed mortgage options, ownership percentages, contingency clauses. These weren't romantic conversations, but they were grounded. For the first time since moving, I felt my name being written into the foundation of our shared life, literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, I continued increasing my presence in my home city. I secured a long-term co-working membership there under the justification of expanding my client network, which was true. I scheduled quarterly visits in advance, immovable, blocked in both our calendars, not as requests, as commitments. When Daniel's family proposed a weekend gathering that conflicted with one of those visits, I said gently, "I'll be away that weekend. We've known about it for months." There was no argument, just recalibration. The fascinating part was this: no one reacted with outrage. No one accused me of selfishness. Because I wasn't acting emotionally, I was acting consistently. Consistency is difficult to challenge. At the same time, I paid attention to Daniel. He began asking more questions about my parents' health, about my projects outside Bristol, about whether I enjoyed being back home. There was curiosity in his voice, and a trace of something else: awareness. One night, he said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you've adjusted for me." I didn't rush to soothe him. "I adjusted because I chose to," I said, "but choosing doesn't mean permanent." He nodded slowly. The sentence stayed in the room longer than we did. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. And part of that growth was understanding this: if you want change without chaos, you move before resentment forms. You draft agreements before crises. You build alternatives before threats. You clarify boundaries before explosions. I wasn't creating pressure. I was creating balance. And balance has consequences, even if no one sees them immediately. Daniel's family began noticing small things. I wasn't always available. I didn't volunteer automatically. I offered opinions without cushioning them excessively. Nothing confrontational, just present. And presence changes dynamics. What they didn't understand yet was that my silence had evolved into architecture. Every financial adjustment, every scheduled visit, every clarified agreement, brick by brick. No one felt lost yet, but the structure of our marriage was shifting quietly. And structures, once reinforced differently, redistribute weight. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed where the weight had moved. Consequences rarely arrive with alarms. They surface as confusion first. It began subtly. Daniel's mother called one Sunday afternoon to confirm a family lunch the following weekend. I was in the room when he answered. He hesitated. "Actually," he said, glancing at me, "we're not free that day." There was a pause on the other end. Even from across the room, I could feel it. "Oh," she replied. "Since when?" Daniel looked at me again, then back toward the window. "We've had plans for a while." We. Not Brielle is away, not she's busy. We. After he hung up, he exhaled quietly. She sounded disappointed. I nodded. "That's understandable." But I didn't offer to rearrange anything. And that was new. The following week, one of his friends messaged him about a last-minute pub night. Normally, Daniel would accept immediately, and I would adjust dinner or join if convenient. This time he asked, "Do we have anything planned?" "We do," I said. "We blocked tonight for us." He frowned slightly. "Right, of course." He declined the invitation. The friend responded jokingly, "Domestic life's got you locked in." Daniel didn't laugh as easily as he once would have. Something was shifting in him, too. At the next family gathering I did attend, the atmosphere felt different. No hostility, but recalibration. When his aunt made a comment about how I was harder to pin down these days, I smiled calmly. "I've been prioritizing balance." She nodded, but her eyes assessed me more carefully. The consequences weren't explosive. They were relational. Daniel's family had grown accustomed to immediate access, to both of us, but especially to me as the flexible extension. Now there were parameters, and parameters create friction before they create respect. Daniel and I had more conversations at night, not arguments, but honest ones. "I feel like things have changed," he said one evening. "They have," I replied. "In a bad way?" I considered that carefully. "In a clearer way." He studied me. "You've become firmer." "I've become more intentional." He didn't argue, but I could see him grappling with something unspoken. The comfort of our old dynamic had been effortless for him. This new one required awareness, and awareness can feel like loss. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected, but it was now forcing our marriage to grow too. When I spent 2 weeks back home helping my parents during one of my father's medical appointments, Daniel stayed in Bristol. We called every night. The connection was steady, but I sensed his unease. Not jealousy, displacement. For the first time, I wasn't orbiting his environment. I was rooted somewhere else, even temporarily. When I returned, he hugged me longer than usual. "I missed you," he said. "I know," I answered softly. But I also noticed something else. While I was away, he had attended fewer family dinners, skipped a pub night, declined a spontaneous weekend trip. Without my smoothing everything, he had to decide independently. And he didn't always choose what others expected. The consequences were spreading quietly. His sister texted me once, "We don't see you much anymore." Not accusatory, just observant. I replied simply, "I'm building a rhythm that works for both of us." She didn't respond immediately. For months, I had feared that asserting balance would fracture relationships. Instead, it was exposing which connections were conditional on my overextension. And that realization, while uncomfortable, was clarifying. No one accused me outright, but I could feel the recalculation happening around me. Expectations were adjusting. Access was no longer assumed. And Daniel, perhaps for the first time, was seeing the weight I had quietly carried. Consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like silence in a room that used to move around you automatically. Sometimes they look like people realizing you are no longer infinitely available. And sometimes they look like a marriage being tested not by betrayal, but by equality. The tension didn't explode. It accumulated, like air pressure in a sealed room, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. It reached a turning point 6 months after I made my quiet decision. Daniel came home one evening, unusually withdrawn. He dropped his keys on the console table and stood there longer than necessary. "What happened?" I asked gently. He ran a hand through his hair. "Mom thinks you're pulling away." I didn't react defensively. "From what?" I asked. "From the family, from Bristol, from S." The last word landed heavier than the rest. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "Do you think I am?" I asked. He hesitated. "I think you're less available. Less automatic." Automatic. The honesty almost made me smile. "Yes," I said quietly. He sat down across from me. "They feel like they've lost something." There it was. Loss. For the first time, someone was naming it. I took a breath. "Daniel, they haven't lost me. They've lost unlimited access to me." He looked at me as if that distinction had never occurred to him. "They're not used to it," he said. "I wasn't used to living without my parents either," I replied. But I adjusted. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, just heavy. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. His mother invited us to dinner more frequently. His sister suggested spontaneous outings. There was an undercurrent of urgency, as if proximity could restore the old rhythm. But rhythms once altered don't reset easily. I attended some, declined others, consistently, and consistency is difficult to argue with. Then came the moment that clarified everything. We were at his parents' house for Sunday lunch. Conversation drifted toward long-term plans, renovations, potential investments, where everyone saw themselves in 10 years. His mother turned to us and said warmly, "You two will be here, of course. This is home now." Not a question, a statement. For the first time, I didn't smile automatically. I answered calmly, "We're still deciding what home looks like long term." The room quieted, not dramatically, but noticeably. Daniel's sister glanced at him. His aunt shifted in her seat. His mother blinked. I thought that was settled. I kept my tone even. It was assumed we're revisiting it. No accusation, no edge, just clarity. On the drive home, Daniel was silent for most of it. Finally, he said, "You could have told me you were going to say that." "I did," I replied softly. "Many times, just not in that room." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't realize how final you felt about it." That was the misunderstanding. I didn't feel final. I felt fair. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But it had also forced me to recognize that indecision favors the person who is already comfortable. And Daniel had been comfortable. Now he wasn't. That night, he admitted something that shifted the atmosphere entirely. "I thought you'd always adapt," he said quietly. "You're so good at it." There was no malice in his voice, just a realization. "I adapted because I loved you," I said, "not because I wanted to disappear." The word disappear lingered. He closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't see that happening." "I know." That was the most honest part. He hadn't seen it, because I had made it seamless. But seamless doesn't mean painless. Over the next few days, he tried to soften things, suggesting compromises, floating vague ideas about maybe spending more time in my hometown someday. But vague wasn't enough anymore. The structure had already shifted. My business was established across cities. My financial footing was independent. My visits home were scheduled months in advance. This wasn't emotional turbulence. It was an architectural change. And once foundations are reinforced differently, you can't pretend the old blueprint still applies. It wasn't too late to save the marriage, but it was too late to return to the version of me that bent first. That woman no longer existed. The real confrontation didn't happen at his parents' house. It happened at our dining table on a quiet Wednesday night. No raised voices, no ultimatums, no packed suitcases by the door. Just two adults sitting across from each other with the kind of clarity that can't be postponed anymore. Daniel had made tea. That detail matters to me. because it showed he understood this wasn't an argument to win. It was a conversation to face. I need to know where you are, he said gently, not emotionally, structurally. I appreciated the word choice. Structurally. I'm not leaving impulsively, I said, but I am no longer willing to live indefinitely in a place where my roots are optional. He nodded slowly. I didn't think you saw them as optional. I didn't either, I replied, until I realized we never built space for them here. Silence settled, but it wasn't tense. It was thoughtful. He leaned forward slightly. Are you saying you want to move back? I'm saying I want a shared plan that doesn't assume your geography is permanent and mine is negotiable. There it was. Clean, direct, calm. He exhaled. I built my career here, my network, my identity. I know, I said, and I moved mine. That sentence wasn't sharp. It was factual. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at me. I think I underestimated what that cost you. I think I underestimated it too, I admitted. That was the truth. For a long time, I had framed my move as a romantic sacrifice, noble even. I hadn't allowed myself to measure the long-term emotional compound interest of distance from my parents, especially as they aged. Living far from my family had forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But growing up also means acknowledging when something no longer aligns. Daniel's voice softened. Are you unhappy? I considered the question carefully. No, I said, but I am incomplete. That word hung in the air between us. Incomplete doesn't accuse. It reveals. He swallowed. And what does completion look like? A life where my family isn't a secondary location, where holidays are balanced intentionally, where our home reflects both of us, not just in photos, but in geography. He nodded, absorbing it. I need time to process that, he said. I'm not asking for a decision tonight, I replied. I wasn't, because this wasn't about forcing him. It was about presenting reality. For the first time since we married, we spoke not as husband and wife defending positions, but as two individuals evaluating a shared future honestly. No one cried. No one accused. We mapped options. Could he work remotely part-time? Could we split the year? Could we invest in property in both cities? These weren't desperate proposals. They were mature negotiations. At one point, he looked at me with something close to awe. You're very steady about this, he said. I've been preparing for months, I answered quietly. That surprised him. Preparing to leave? Preparing to be equal. He absorbed that slowly. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with understanding. He finally saw the architecture I had been building silently, and I finally saw his fear, not of losing control, but of losing familiarity. As we went to bed that night, there was no dramatic embrace, just a different kind of closeness. Honest. For the first time, my presence in the marriage wasn't assumed. It was recognized. And recognition, I realize, is often more powerful than apology. It has been a year since that conversation at the dining table. We did not divorce. We did not run away from each other either. We rebuilt deliberately. Daniel now works remotely 2 weeks out of every month. It required negotiation with his firm, restructuring projects, and letting go of certain conveniences. It wasn't effortless. That mattered to me. We rent a small flat in my hometown. Nothing extravagant. Just enough space to live fully when we're there. My parents come for dinner on Thursdays. Sometimes my father falls asleep on the sofa after dessert, and Daniel covers him with a blanket without hesitation. The first time I saw that, something inside me softened. Not because he was performing, because he had chosen to step into my world. Back in Bristol, we remain present too. His family still gathers on Sundays. His mother has adjusted more than I expected. She no longer assumes attendance. She asks. That shift, from assumption to invitation, changed everything. The marriage feels different now. Not lighter, stronger. Because it is no longer built on my flexibility alone. I am no longer the easy one. I am the clear one. And clarity has reshaped how people interact with me. His sister consults me directly about plans instead of routing through Daniel. His friends ask about my projects with genuine interest. Not because I demanded respect loudly, but because I stopped volunteering invisibility. Living far from my family forced me to grow up faster than I expected. But returning part-time forced me to integrate who I've become. I am not the woman who moved blindly for love anymore. I am the woman who can move and stay by choice. The difference is subtle but profound. There is no bitterness in me. I don't look back at the early months with resentment. I understand now that I participated in my own shrinking. I mistook silence for grace. I confused adaptation with maturity. But growth isn't about punishing your past self. It's about honoring what she survived quietly. Sometimes I think about the version of me standing in that kitchen during our first Christmas in Bristol, unsure where the tea towels were kept. She wasn't weak. She was adjusting without a map. Now I carry my own map, financially structured, emotionally anchored, geographically balanced. Daniel once asked me recently, half smiling, "Do you think we would have made it if you hadn't pushed back?" I answered honestly, "No, but I didn't push, I positioned." That distinction still matters to me. There was no explosion, no dramatic exit, just a woman deciding that love should not require disappearance, and discovering that when you stop disappearing, people either step forward or step aside. Daniel stepped forward, not perfectly, not instantly, but intentionally. And intention is enough. I am still calm, still measured, still the woman who doesn't shout in rooms. But now when I speak, I don't shrink afterward. Now when I say no, it doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like alignment. Home, I've learned, is not just where you live. It's where you are allowed to exist fully. And for the first time since I married someone from another city and lost my sense of home, I have it again, not because I moved back entirely, but because I stopped leaving myself behind. When I look back now, I don't see a villain in my story. I see two people who loved each other, and one of them who quietly disappeared for a while. There was no betrayal, no cruelty, no dramatic explosion that forced change. There was only an imbalance, and an imbalance left unexamined slowly becomes identity. I married someone from another city and lost my sense of home, not because anyone took it from me, but because I handed parts of it over in the name of being understanding. Living far from my family forced me to grow up faster than I expected. It taught me independence, discipline, and resilience. But more importantly, it taught me that adulthood is not about enduring silently. It's about recognizing when silence stops being grace and starts being self-erasure. The turning point in my life wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It wasn't walking away. It was paperwork, boundaries, calendar blocks, clear sentences spoken without apology. It was understood that love is not proven by how much you can absorb. It is proven by how much space both people are willing to make for each other. If Daniel had refused to adjust, I would have left, calmly, structurally, without theatrics. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I had started loving myself properly. That's the part we don't talk about enough. You can be kind and still require equality. You can be calm and still be firm. You can love deeply and still refuse to disappear. Home, I've learned, isn't a postcode. It's the feeling that your history, your family, your needs, and your future are not secondary in your own life. If you've ever moved for love and slowly felt yourself becoming smaller, if you've ever been praised for being easy while quietly carrying more than your share, if you've ever wondered whether asking for balance would cost you everything, I want you to know this. Clarity doesn't destroy healthy love. It reveals whether it's mutual. So I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever mistaken being adaptable for being invisible? And what would change if you stopped?